Hi, my name is Louise Manning and I'm Professor of Agri-Food and Supply Chain Security at the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester. So this webinar we're going to look at food fraud and we're going to consider what are the challenges that sit around food fraud, but also the solutions. So I'm going to start by taking a few minutes to set the scene and to talk about the theory that sits behind food fraud, essentially what food crime is and also food fraud, and what steps businesses can take to reduce vulnerability. And then we'll open up to questions and we'll be able to discuss it in more detail. If you look in the literature and across the internet, websites, reports, etc., you will see many definitions of both food crime and food fraud. And I just wanted to start by giving you one definition from the United Kingdom and the Food Standards Agency's National Food Crime Unit. The National Food Crime Unit was set up after the 2014 horse meat incident as a direct recommendation from the Elliott Review that was undertaken by Professor Chris Elliott, looking at how we could develop integrity in our supply chains as a result of reflecting on what had happened with the horse meat incident. So the National Food Crime Unit works to prevent, detect and investigate food crime. In terms of their definitions, food crime is serious fraud. And when we think of serious activity, we can think of organised crime, for example, or large-scale intention to defraud either businesses in the UK or consumers, or both. So food crime is seen as being a serious fraud that impacts both the safety or the authenticity of food, drink or animal feed. So it's important to consider that although we might use the term food crime, that we're thinking not only of food and drink, but also animal feed as well. Because a potential agent that is put into animal feed could, if it goes through the whole supply chain, say for example in the muscle of animals and then meat, could cause a food safety issue for consumers. So we've talked a little bit about food crime. Let's now think of the different types of food crime. The UK's National Food Crime Unit focuses its work on 7 types of food crime, and those are presented here on the slide. And if you look in other literature, you will see similar categories of either food crime or food fraud represented. We can divide these into those which are directly related to the product. So it is the product itself, where a foreign substance or a substandard or inferior ingredient has been added, namely adulteration and substitution. Those that affect the documentation or packaging or labelling of the product. And here on the slide you will see document fraud and misrepresentation. So marketing or labelling a product to incorrectly portray either its quality, its safety, its nutritional value, or its origins. And those that relate to criminal activity that sits around the legitimate supply chain. So we very quickly touched on the particular types of food crime and food fraud, whether they're associated with the product itself, the packaging, claims or documentation that are aligned with that product, or indeed illegal activities that can interface with the legitimate supply chain. Each individual business will have to identify its vulnerability to food fraud. And for many manufacturers, they are now being asked to document their food fraud vulnerability assessments and identify particular levels of risk associated with their products. Vulnerability is a really interesting concept because it's not just about quantifying what you believe your vulnerability is in terms of likelihood, severity, susceptibility or exposure, developing a risk matrix, for example. But it's also about that gut feel. That person who's worked in the industry for a very, very long time that says, what I've been offered in terms of a price or access to materials is just too good to be true. The discount that I can get on this product is just too good to be true. And that begins to raise alarm bells as to whether you are making yourselves vulnerable to food crime or food fraud. When we think of vulnerability, we need to start categorizing it because the number of potential issues associated with food fraud are endless for a particular business. So we can think about intrinsic vulnerabilities. What are those vulnerabilities that occur within our business at the micro level with individuals or the meso level? So they're organizational. In theory, we should be able to control intrinsic vulnerabilities that occur within our business or are under the control of our business much better than extrinsic vulnerabilities. So extrinsic vulnerabilities occur at that macro level, the external environment, and they can be numerous and unexpected. So, for example, if we are thinking about COVID-19 and its impact on food supply chains, many of the aspects of how our supply chains have been affected and vulnerability of individual businesses is very difficult to control. So we need to think about, are the vulnerabilities we're considering intrinsic and within our business operation, or are they extrinsic? They can be shocks, triggers, squeezes that can impact on our product, as we talked about in the previous webinar when we looked at resilience, but they're much harder for us to control. So what are the 4 steps to developing a food fraud risk assessment and then to develop a mitigation strategy that reduces your business's vulnerability to food fraud and wider food crime? First of all, you need to look at the threats that could impact on your business. So what are the global threats? The threats that are of issue to every business, and also the specific threats that because of your product and your organisation you need to consider. Step 2, you develop a situational list of threats for your product and organisation. Why is it called situational? Because the list of threats could change tomorrow. You could have a major issue in one of the countries where they are growing one of your vital ingredients. Suddenly 20% of the supply is taken out of the market, and that creates an opportunity for others to adulterate, substitute, and then you have an issue with food crime that you need to address. So that situational list needs to be reviewed on a regular basis. Step 3, you need to undertake a food fraud or food crime risk assessment. Why have I got both there? Because you may say, the first time we're going to do this, we're going to look at the product itself. We're just going to focus on adulteration or substitution. Or you may widen the scope to look at document fraud, misrepresentation and labelling. Or as an organisation and business, you say, we're going to look at all 7 types of food crime as identified by the National Food Crime Unit. When you're doing your risk assessment, you'll identify what countermeasures against fraud and crime you currently have in place. Do you need to introduce others? And again, in the questioning, I hope we expand on this area more. And then step 4, you need to implement your countermeasures to reduce your vulnerability to food crime. Having taken all of these measures, you then need to start again. What are the emerging global threats and specific threats for your business? Do you need to update your situational list of threats? Do you need to change the risk ranking in your food fraud or food crime risk assessment? What new countermeasures do you need to implement? And this is an ongoing cycle for any business in order to reduce their vulnerability to food fraud. So now we're going to open up to the question and answer and debate element of the webinar. Hopefully this quick review has set the scene on what food fraud and food crime is, and also the steps businesses can take to reduce vulnerability.